Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you all, and welcome to the Miller Center's 2023 William and Carol Stevenson Conference. We hold this event every other year, focusing on the most important national and international issues of our time, and a huge thanks to the Stevenson family for endowing it and for the support they've shown to the Miller Center over the years. 11 years ago, my wife and 2 daughters and I arrived in Beijing for 3 months of research. Before leaving, Brookings had equipped me with a brand new laptop and cell phone, burners as they're known, and many of you who've traveled have had them. At the time, Brookings was deeply concerned about a hack of our computer system where much of our data had been exfiltrated by a foreign agent. Shortly after we arrived, we moved into our Beijing apartment, and a technician from the apartment complex knocked on our door to fix a mirror in our bathroom that didn't appear to be broken. He would return every few days to keep fixing the mirror. Not feeling that we had anything to hide, my wife and daughters and I enjoyed laughing and speculating. Our daughters were 10 and 8 at the time, speculating about what this technician was up to. But I did start to wonder from time to time, should I say or write all of my reactions to the particular meetings that I was having? If I was interviewing a person, would I be putting them at risk? Was I putting my Chinese national assistant at risk who came to the apartment on a regular basis? So 11 years later, all 4 of us carry one of these. It has a camera and a microphone and apps that may be recording anything and everything that we do and say and sharing it with U.S. technology giants, as well as perhaps with Chinese authorities. So when Ann Kokas proposed the Stevenson Conference and that it be on the U.S. China technology competition, following up on her own great scholarship in this regard, it seemed important, exciting, and prescient. Ann is the C.K. Yellen Professor here at the Miller Center and Director of the University of Virginia's East Asia Center, and also an Associate Professor of Media Studies at UVA. She's also a Fellow in the Public Intellectuals Program at the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. What I had not realized that she would not only plan this agenda so well, that she would time it perfectly to be the day after Secretary Yellen gave a major, Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, gave a major speech on U.S. China competition. Yesterday, Secretary Yellen started with the monumental challenges facing the world. Recovery from a pandemic, the biggest European land war since World War II, potential military conflicts in Asia, and economic stress at home and abroad. And she said yesterday, progress on these issues requires constructive engagement between the world's 2 largest economies, yet our relationship clearly is at a tense moment. It's quite an understatement. With a major war in Europe and fears of one in Asia rising, it was little surprise that national security topped the list. How does China's military use technology? What technologies might it be supplying to Russia in their no limits partnership that would aid Russia's horrendous invasion of Ukraine? These are major security challenges. Secretary Yellen also warned against an overreaction. Unlike the first Cold War, levels of trade and integration between the United States and China are exceptionally deep and strong still. China is the U.S.'s 3rd largest trading partner. And China's extraordinary quarter century of economic growth has been fueled by that integration. And as Secretary Yellen said, decoupling would be disastrous for both countries and for the world. Moreover, it might make China more likely to do something dangerous militarily in East Asia. I suspect others today will want to talk about Secretary Yellen's speech. Is it possible to establish an equilibrium that would include fair rules of the road for competition. Is it possible to work on common challenges, such as the big debt issues faced by many developing countries and the fight against climate change? Beyond that, at the center of these questions is a topic that Ann Kokes has built this conference around: democracy. This competition was taking place at a time when our own democracy faces enormous pressures to sustain itself. The way that U.S. China competition and cooperation, particularly in technology, will shape democracy here at home is essential to this conversation as well. In other words, has democracy met its match? Is China's growing economic power, combined with technologies we've helped them develop, creating an alternative model to liberal democracies around the world? Are liberal democracies committed enough internally and amongst themselves to maintaining core principles of intellectual property, freedom of expression, protection of individual privacy, and human rights? Indeed, are the U.S. and other corporations from the leading, are leading corporations from the U.S. and other leading democracies themselves chipping away at essential elements of our democracy? These questions will be woven through our three panels today. The first focuses on apps, platforms, and surveillance. The second highlights China's role in the global business and financial sectors. And the third hones in on how U.S. competition may play out with respect to new climate technologies, at a time when the U.S. has just made its greatest investment ever in clean energy technology. Our first panel is informed by pressing current events. States across the country have begun restricting the use of TikTok and other Chinese apps due to fears regarding data privacy, with Montana banning the app entirely last week. Federal regulators have cracked down on TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, to give up control of U.S. operations or sell the platform completely. Especially in light of the recent national security document leaks and the Chinese spy balloons, it is important to examine how social media intersects with national security and democracy interests with regards to China. Fortunately, we have three excellent panelists with us today to discuss these issues. Josh Chin is Deputy China Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal. There's Josh. And the co-author of Surveillance State: Inside China's Quest to Launch a New Era of Social Control. He previously won the Gerald Loeb Award for International Reporting for a series exposing China's government's pioneering experiments with digital surveillance. Kara Frederick, behind me, is the director of the Tech Policy Center at the Heritage Foundation. Before that, she worked as a fellow at the Center for New American Security and led Facebook's Global Security Counterterrorism Analysis Program. More importantly than her impressive career, Kara graduated from UVA in 2007, so it's always great to have a Wahoo back home.
I'm home.
And finally, Shanti Kalatil is founder and principal at MDO Advisors with an expertise in national security issues in the information age. She previously served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator for Democracy and Human Rights at the National Security Council. She was also previously the Senior Director for the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy. And this conversation will be moderated by Ann Kokes. So without further ado, Ann, over to you.
Thank you so much, Bill. And I'd like to thank our three esteemed panelists from whom I have learned so much over the years in studying this area. So it's a great honor and a privilege to be here with you. I'd also like to welcome our in-person and online guests to the Miller Center and give a special welcome to my students in the University of Virginia Engagements course, The Data Ethics of TikTok, many of whom are coming to the Miller Center for the first time. So just to begin, in yesterday's speech on the economic relationship with China at Johns Hopkins University, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen argued that the U.S., quote unquote, will assert ourselves when our vital interests are at stake, but we do not seek to, quote unquote, decouple from our interests from our economy from China's. What are the key areas that you observe in your work where this tension between vital interests and economic engagement are the most delicate in the tech sector? Secretary Yellen, for example, highlighted China's export of surveillance equipment as well as forced technology transfer from foreign to domestic firms. And I was wondering if there were other areas that you might highlight or other areas where you see this issue as particularly in tension. Shanti, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Anne, and thank you so much to the Miller Center for hosting this wonderful event. I have also learned a tremendous amount from the panelists here, from the books that you've put out. I highly recommend them. And actually, some of the points that you've made in your publications have really informed my thinking on these issues. So to the point about balancing these issues, I mean, I think that's always been present in U.S. foreign policy, but of course it's come to a particular focal point now. I actually have been thinking about a term that more accurately, in my view, represents some of the dynamics involved, because I think when we talk about decoupling, it sounds almost unrealistic in an age where our economies are so deeply entwined and intermeshed. You know, the Europeans have been using a term de-risking, and when I think about the types of concerns broadly that we are going to be talking about today, I do think about risk, for instance, risk to national security, risk to democracy and human rights, risk to personal security, a lot of different ways that you can quantify that risk. And so in thinking about the types of risks involved, I just wanted to make a few points about some of the topics of this panel and relate it to something that Bill mentioned at the beginning, which is about democracy. And so the first point is that you know, I think for many years we saw technology as a tool that could either amplify or consolidate democracy or perhaps pose dangers through its usage. Increasingly, I've come to believe that technology is actually the site where the future of democracy and rights is going to be determined, that they're actually inextricable now. And actually, some of the stories that Josh has mentioned in his recent book drive that home really well. You know, you have an anecdote about a Uyghur family and their experiences in China. Where really trying to untangle those issues is impossible. So that's kind of the first point, which is that I think we need to stop seeing those issues in isolation. We have to accept that if we are talking about democratic processes, we must think about technology. The second is actually something that you brought up in your own book, Anne, which is about the different ways in which data can be trafficked around the world, and you particularly focus on China. I think that obviously we will probably talk about TikTok today. This is, you know, a big issue, but I would really encourage folks to widen that aperture a little bit and think about the many other ways in which data can be exfiltrated and trafficked and used in different ways, especially in ways that I think are detrimental to democracy and human rights. And there are, well, we can get into more detail later, but you have mentioned in your own work issues around the health sector, around gaming, around phenomena like smart cities, where I think some of the nuances around data and the ways it can be used have been lost when we talk about these issues. And then the final thing I'll just say very briefly is I would love it if we could then extrapolate from our knowledge of what we know now to the near future. And as we all know, we've seen tremendous advances in artificial intelligence just within the last few months, which I think are going to be something of a game changer when we talk about the ways in which we interact with information, the ways in which we interact with data. I think we have not been creative enough in thinking about the different ways in which, for example, generative AI or different kinds of virtual or augmented reality, the kinds of things that we see coming just over the horizon could be used in any number of ways that I think will be equally, if not more, worrisome than some of the things we're talking about today.
Thank you. Josh?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough act to follow, Shanti. Basically, what she said. I mean, maybe I can advance this a little bit by just getting a little bit more specific. I think it's it's really fascinating to think about decoupling and the tensions involved in that, or de-risking, as it were, for the U.S. and the areas that I cover, which is surveillance and AI. That is actually one area where the U.S. has really made a pretty clear decision, particularly when it comes to chips. And the U.S. dominance of the semiconductor industry. I was actually quite surprised at how decisive the U.S. was on this. When I first started covering this field, it just seemed that there was nothing anyone could do because huge American tech companies had a major interest in selling chips to China. They have massive business. You have Intel is the obvious one. There's another one named NVIDIA. It's based in California that makes what are called graphics processing units, which originally developed for video games, but turn out to be really, really good for AI and are now the gold standard for AI. And in fact, there's an entire NVIDIA ecosystem that most companies that do serious AI work kind of have to use if they want to be cutting edge. And they were doing huge amounts of business in China. And it always felt like there was no way for the US government, whatever its concerns were about the US providing these technologies to Chinese surveillance firms or to the Chinese military, that there was no way they were going to overcome the objections of industry against cutting that off, and they did. So it's interesting. I mean, it was a very interesting choice that they made, and they've continued to put pressure and on companies and cut off Chinese access to that technology. There are loopholes. China's figured out ways to get around that, but it has really affected China's ability to do that sort of work. So I think that's interesting in that sense that the U.S. really has made a decision, at least in that one core area. But I mean, zooming out a little bit, I mean, she did mention exports of surveillance, and I think this is actually one of these areas that this is probably touches on what I think is the most interesting, or one of the most interesting tensions when you talk about the role that technology plays in the future of democracy. And I totally agree with Shanti. I think they're indivisible now. They are basically, technology is where the future of democracy is going to play out. And when I was working on my book, one of the places I went to when looking at China's exports of surveillance equipment was Uganda, which is a really fascinating test case because it is a country that gets a huge amount of aid from the U.S. Has been supported by the U.S. It was held up at one point as a potential sort of democratic model for the future of sub-Saharan Africa. It since has become a much more authoritarian place. China and has become a place where China and the U.S. are now wrestling for influence. And the story that I went there to report with colleagues was in 2018 and 2019, Yoweri Museveni, the leader of Uganda, was facing a huge political challenge from a sort of upstart young singer who had sort of rallied the youth in opposition to him, and his solution was to go to the Chinese embassy and ask for help. And the Chinese embassy worked with Huawei, which has a huge presence there. They took a bunch of Ugandan police on a trip to China, took them to the Ministry of Public Security offices off of Tiananmen Square, showed them how it all worked, and then basically sold Museveni a sort of a starter kit, a state surveillance starter kit, which he then did use in the most recent election, I think probably to great effect. I mean, he did win it. There are people who doubt the results, but he has basically used that system to really neutralize a major threat to his power and sort of crush democracy, at least for now, in Uganda. And I think what that story illustrated to me is the power of China's appeal to countries that are sort of on the verge of kind of teetering one way towards either democracy or authoritarianism. China comes with these systems. I don't think it's trying to necessarily replicate the China model everywhere, but it is offering these systems and ideas about how to use these technologies to anyone who will buy them. And it basically it's a sort of laissez-faire attitude that says, here you go. We don't care how you use it, just use it. And we'll teach you what you want to do is repress your political enemies. We'll teach you how to do that, and that's enormously attractive to a large number of countries. And I think what the U.S. has not done, the U.S. has talked about trying to restrict. I mean, they've obviously ran a campaign against Huawei that has been very successful in terms of keeping Huawei's 5G technology out of allied countries. But the U.S. has not really developed an alternative model that can compete with China's. Yeah. There's no vision, there's no democratic vision coming out of the US about the uses of these technologies, how you can use them, how you can extract the positive uses of these technologies while mitigating against the negative ones. And I think that's one of the real challenges the U.S. faces right now.
Well, I'm a little insulted because I wrote a whole paper called Democracy by Design that attempted to have that affirmative vision, and I guess Josh didn't read it, but if you guys do. So no, I do think I can build upon what Shanti and Josh has said, so tell me in a few minutes if it works. It might not. But what I think in terms of the delicate things that we're not thinking about, that are integrated, that we don't really know, I'm looking at the information environment. I think that's, I used to work in the intelligence community for the United States and then Facebook after that. And what stood out to me when I went to Silicon Valley from working in DC in the government was, you had people from the diaspora, you had Chinese Americans, and even at the time, people on H-1B visas who were working as programmers at Facebook. We didn't necessarily have that geopolitical cognition, like, oh, there's a history of forced tech transfer, of IP theft, and you're just kind of, working with the guy with the visa next to you, and he happens to be from China. But with Confucius Institutes and United Front work and everything like that, I think what Jen Easterly had called she caught a lot of flack for this, but the cognitive landscape I think is extremely important. So Josh talked a lot about these surveillance packages and all of the hard cyber concerns, the data collection mechanisms. Shanti alluded to that as well, but when you look at something like TikTok, again, Shanti mentioned it, I'll use TikTok as a synecdoche for, sort of the next TikTok. All of these digital platforms, which have, maybe parent companies headquartered in Beijing, subject to the PRC's laws and policies. And I'll say that there is a way to manipulate the information environment through these digital platforms that, we hadn't thought about for a long time. You had great reporting from Forbes and BuzzFeed, RIP, some of those journalists have basically revealed that there are actual narrative pushes going on these platforms. There are censorship initiatives. People will say, okay, you can still access some of the news about the atrocities in Xinjiang, but we know, at least from course reporting by February 2019, a lot of this reporting was censored. Hong Kong protests, same thing. Mentions of Tiananmen Square or Tibet, those kinds of things were censored. And then there are, on the alternative angle, they're trying to push CCP propaganda effectively. Top Buzz was laundering a lot of those stories through that app. Again, Forbes and BuzzFeed reporting revealed some of that, and whistleblowers as well when it comes to TikTok. So I think it's sort of important to, when you think about sort of the next generation of citizens, there's a lot of young people in this room right now, and we know that Google is running scared when it comes to how people get their news. American adults in the last 2 years, the American adults who get their news from TikTok has tripled. So what does that mean for the information environment when, as Director Christopher Wray said, this algorithm actually is, he said verbatim, controlled by China. And we know that when Project Texas was sort of floated as the thing that will mollify a lot of the U.S. national security concerns, China a few years ago, even before Project Texas was just in its infancy, they basically said, we're not going to give up the algorithm, and then they instituted some export controls, which will likely cover the algorithm as well. So when there's a commercial aspect to that, but then there's also that information cognitive security aspect too. If what is being pumped into the brains of our children, 67% of American teens are on TikTok as of last year, matters too. So I think there's sort of a something that we don't think, it's a little more squishy, but in terms of decoupling, do we want to cede the information environment totally to something that is CCP owned and control? I would say no.
Okay, so Kara, actually, I was trying to start off with a soft, like non-TikTok, but because once we let it out of the box, we can't put it back in. No, but I think this is really a question on a lot of people's minds. We have the recent congressional testimony. And this actually, Kara's point brought up another question that I wanted to ask you, especially since we are at a university campus. So when we see these discussions about data privacy and security in government, by targeting an app that is uniquely popular. So Kara brought up the cognitive environment, the experience of sharing information on social media apps and what that might do in terms of how we understand our world. But by targeting an app that is uniquely popular with millennials and Gen Z, has the U.S. government in some ways already failed to convince younger generations by presenting this as a conflict between youthful influencers and the political gerontocracy? Will young people simply dismiss well-placed concerns about surveillance and authoritarian-linked platforms in the future because of these generational differences in our understanding and use of technology? And I'd be really curious to see, each of you have worked in this area in different ways, and I'm curious about your perspectives on this. So as Kara posed these risks, how does does the regulatory landscape in the U.S. contend with these generational differences?
Yeah, and I think Chatham House rules and other conversations that I've had, but I was talking with a handful of representatives of Congress members yesterday, and it appeared that they are very much aware of what you just identified. The fact that, oh no, like what can we do? When you have the Commerce Secretary, everyone's probably familiar with the Restrict Act right now, and that was sort of the bipartisan.
Could you actually just give us?
Sorry. I just drove in from DC, so I'm DC brained, guys. So you'll have to stop me. But the Restrict Act is a piece of draft legislation. It has at least a dozen bipartisan co-sponsors, and what it seeks to do is develop a risk-based framework for contending with these digital platforms that emanate from our foreign adversaries. And there's been, I work at the Heritage Foundation, we're a conservative institution. There's been concerns on the right about the erosion of trust in institutions, of U.S. institutions, given surveillance mechanisms sort of turn inward on our citizens. But on the left, you have the Secretary of Commerce, which this Restrict Act would, give her authority to make these determinations about the risks of these foreign-owned platforms. You have the Commerce Secretary effectively saying, if we ban TikTok, then I'm afraid we're going to lose every voter under the age of 35. So everyone is sort of aware that this is a problem in terms of TikTok having a target on its back when TikTok influencers are traipsing around the White House, when there are discussions of potentially creating a press room for these TikTok and social media influencers too. So I think it is a problem. I think it is a problem that nobody likes to appear out of touch, but there are very real concerns with these platforms. And again, not just TikTok, but the next TikTok. You have Lemonade, which is I don't know if the kids in the room know what this is, but it's basically as if other people have said, as if Instagram and Pinterest have a baby. It's headquartered its parent company is headquartered in China as well. So sort of the same sort of data collection issues, 2017 national intelligence law issues with these companies as well. So I don't want to say the well has been poisoned by these tensions, but it is troubling when the negotiation between convenience and privacy, or fun and privacy, is something that I do think the younger demographic has a different view of. And really the only way to contend with that is to be as clear as possible, frankly, to the parents. I'm a new mom. You might have seen my baby. My sister took her out in the back. But I'm very worried about the potential for building the dossiers like we used to do in the intelligence community, based off of integrating a lot of these data streams, seemingly disparate data sets that China can take its hacked materials from the OPM hack, the Equifax hack, the Anthem hack, the Marriott hack, and sort of integrate these data sets together with artificial intelligence, which the specialty of AI is it parses through large amounts of data and it pulls out insight. It is able to detect anomalies, identify patterns. What does that look like in a place when you're looking at dissidents? Then it helps identify people who are sort of the Uyghurs of the world. So I think that we need to appeal directly to parents for the next generation coming up, but it is going to be an uphill battle given the fact that this platform is embedded in America now.
Yeah. So so Josh actually had brought up a really interesting TikTok-related point, and I want to make sure to give you a chance to address this as the journalist in the room. So how might we contend with the privacy versus free speech aspects of the TikTok issue? More generally, how might we think about balancing privacy, free speech, and national security in the U.S. China tech trade? So you both are journalists, and you've written about state surveillance, so I can imagine your perspective on this is quite complex.
Yeah, I mean, to lay my cards out on the table, as a journalist and a journalist working in China, I do have a sort of, I get a little twitchy when people start talking about banning sources of information. The Wall Street Journal we actually had a really, really successful Chinese language website for years when I first joined. And it was actually quite amazing to see, just as to be writing for that or having my stories translated for that website and to be able to interact with Chinese people who could access it and just see, my reporting not just be consumed by American readers but Chinese readers as well. And it got banned. Actually, it was around, I think, the 25th anniversary of Tiananmen Square when we started digging up our old stories from back then and publishing them on the blog that I ran and then translating them into Chinese. The government didn't like that very much. So they banned the whole website, and it's still banned. And the website of the Chinese website of the New York Times and English websites of the New York Times, the Washington Post, everyone is banned now. And the Chinese argument is that our websites are agents of, are vectors for foreign influence, right? And so, I obviously disagree with that, and so I'm a little bit. I feel like it's a difficult tension that we have to wrestle with when you think about, if you care about free speech, when you're thinking about TikTok, and I do think there's an opportunity here in the U.S. And I mentioned earlier that the U.S. hasn't really put forth a model on how to deal with surveillance and the collection of data and these sorts of technologies. And one of the most amazing things about the U.S. is that we do not have federal data privacy legislation, right?
Amazing and generous term.
And actually, I'm probably not the most qualified person to speak about this because I write about China, not the U.S. But it is remarkable. When I was looking around, writing about state surveillance, China has actually quite robust data privacy protections. They have a huge carve out for the government that is problematic, but otherwise is quite strong. Obviously, Europe has very strong regulations. The UK. The reason the U.S. doesn't, there are a lot of reasons. Obviously, one of them is the influence of Silicon Valley, of tech giants. They have a huge interest in being able to access as much data as possible. Their entire business model is built on that, and they have lobbied quite hard against this bill. But it is interesting when you think about TikTok and you think about trying to persuade younger people that you're not just taking away their favorite social media platform for no reason with a ban. An alternative approach to this is to use TikTok as a way to help propel privacy legislation. If you care about data and you care about tech companies exploiting data, whether they're Chinese, American, Russian, or whatever, privacy legislation will go a long way, or at least as a first step to sort of mitigating that. And that's something that is if you apply it across the board, is consistent, right? And it's an argument you can make. And it was, the CEO of TikTok, when he was testifying before Congress, he was making this point. I don't think anyone was, or very few people were listening, but he kept saying, nothing that we do in terms of data collection is different than anyone else in Silicon Valley. And you may be able to argue with that around the margins, but the amount of data that Silicon Valley tech giants collect is astonishing, right? And so it is, what is China doing with it, or what is TikTok doing with it? That's a whole other question. But I think the main issue is you're talking about how do you restrict TikTok, if you're concerned about TikTok, from collecting that information in the first place. And I think actually having privacy legislation is probably is a solution that will sort of get you out of having to face down your angry teenager.
Can I also make one point on that? Because I do agree with, and sorry for Shanti if you want to jump in, but I do agree with that aspect of Josh's argument wholeheartedly. Again, in my paper, TikTok, a CCP official in every pocket, out now, we talk about how there are ways for TikTok to get U.S. user data apart from banning the digital platform from operating in the U.S. market. So that is a massive point. Americans should clearly understand how their data is stored, collected, and shared. And TikTok can get the data because of these mechanisms, because of these SDKs, software development kits, and the way that data is shared and used, especially with third parties too. So I think that is a fantastic point, and that would help sort of shore up these security issues as well.
Yeah. So come to the Miller Center. We can have bipartisan agreement on important issues. So Shanti, I wanted to. So one of the things that we've discussed in our conversations is that it's not, when we see TikTok, there are other Chinese tech platforms operating in the U.S. How do these risks differ or not from U.S.-based apps? And more importantly, do you think that current debates focus on the right risks, or are there other ways that you might reframe these issues? So, for example, are there features of the U.S. political system that have led to focusing on specific single apps or specific companies rather than these kind of larger data privacy issues? And as someone who who worked in the administration, how did you and your team, to the degree that you can share, kind of balance these challenges of actually being able to move something forward versus kind of coming up with these larger conceptual questions?
Yeah, I mean that's a big question, and the way that I first of all, I think that was a great discussion that we just had, and I agree that it is hard to walk things back and to try to introduce new attitudes towards privacy, for instance. And to get to your question, I do think it goes beyond just whatever app we're obsessed about at the moment. Kara, you brought up Lemonade, which is, I understand, becoming more popular. It's based on a Chinese app, Xiaohongshu and Little Red Book, and are we just going to keep trying to ban all the apps? While at the same time, there are so many other places that just as important data, perhaps more important data, can be gathered. In your own book, and again, you talk about the health sector and the ways in which so many kinds of health data is now collected by apps that's not protected by HIPAA. Yeah. And I think very few people are aware of that. When you get on an app and you say, well, I'm going to track my sleep or my breathing or whatever, you're giving up so many pieces of your biometric information without even realizing it. And it's one of those ways in which I don't know if comprehensive privacy data protections would completely help, but certainly it's a layer that we would absolutely need to have to start getting at some of these wider issues. I'm not kidding when I said I really have been inspired by your books, both of you, but one chapter you have in your book, Anne, is on gaming. And you talk about TikTok being sensitive. You want to take games away from the youth? I mean, good luck. However, the fascinating thing that I think not many people are aware of is the Tencent, which is one of the big Chinese companies, and Josh, you may address this in your book as well. It is a huge player in the gaming industry, yet it is completely not being looked at. I think part of the reason is in our own policy debates in this country, it is hard for us to do more than one thing at once and to look at more than one thing at once, and so it's easier to kind of pick out one thing and then let's just go full bore on that. That's not to say there aren't legitimate concerns with TikTok, for instance. But when you look at this broader landscape, gaming, as you point out, also is a site of tremendous data generation, potential data trafficking, patterns of behavior, patterns of social networking, financial transactions. So many different things are bound up in that platform. So that's all to say, I think we need to be more aware of the various types of ways, as opposed to focusing on a single app or issue. Let's look at the broader landscape and try to better educate ourselves about these issues. And then just, to talk about how to get at some of these issues, I will say, when I was in government, obviously we couldn't look at the full, my team was focused on a set of specific things. One thing that we tried to do through the Summit for Democracy, the first one, and which I understand, I followed some of the outcomes of the second, is to use that as a way to advance some of the more proactive thinking about technology that you mentioned, Josh, and I think Kara, you referred to as some of, how do we actually both try to clamp down on the bad stuff and then push forward some of, like, make sure that we're showing up in ways that show that technology can actually enhance democracy as opposed to, be used as a tool to restrict human rights. One initiative, again, this is something that I'm a private citizen now, so I was just watching this latest summit and some of the things that came out of it. But there is an initiative to try to work on curbing the export of spyware, commercial spyware, which I think is really important, especially if you've tracked the ways in which authoritarian regimes clamp down and actually use commercial spyware to repress dissidents around the world. So that's in instances of transnational repression, where, for instance, Uyghurs that may have fled to other places would still be tracked by the Chinese government because, they could be subject to this kind of spyware. So one of the ways where I think trying to make different pieces of this puzzle work, at least focusing on a couple of these discrete initiatives, I think can help make a difference. And particularly when it comes to really important issues like transnational repression, this commercial spyware piece could actually be quite significant.
Thank you. Josh or Kara, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think all of those points are impressive and right. Especially when you look at sort of sensitive, personally identifiable information, alluding to healthcare and whatnot, why not enshrine biometric data as sensitive data with a proper NIST framework and standards? So I think that is just low-hanging fruit that we haven't gotten around to that can be integrated into a national data privacy protection framework that would, I think, go a long way, as you said, in sort of layering those protections for the American people. So yeah, there are simple, even technical fixes for this kind of thing. And the last sort of technical fix that I'll talk about is I think privacy preserving technologies, whoever finds the privacy solution is not only going to be very rich, but going to do a big service for democracy, I think, across the globe. So the United States has the opportunity to really dictate the design of these products that are imbued with privacy protections. I mean, in the design phase, we talk about privacy by design a lot, and instead of having to go back and say retrofit these privacy protections like we're trying to do now, try to, if programmers, if commercial entities, maybe even nudged by the government, by Congress, representatives of the people, at this point are pushed in the direction to imbuing those privacy protections in the design of a lot of these products that we then seed throughout the world to our friends in Japan and India and whatnot. I think that could go a long way in sort of preserving the system that we want to see reign, vice the closed system that the CCP is propagating.
So thank you for those policy suggestions and for all of you. I'm actually very eager. We have a terrific audience today. And the in-person audience has index cards on their seats. Attendees can submit those questions to Alfred Reeves, who's in the back. Alfred, do you want to raise your hand? Okay, so you can submit your questions to Alfred Reeves. Attendees can also, the online audience can also use the Q&A function on the bottom of the screen to submit questions. So we are eager to hear audience questions. So I'd urge all of you to submit those questions as you're preparing them, and then I'll go with one question just to make sure our audience can get prepped to ask those questions. So now, one final question for you guys as we're preparing for our audience questions. Thinking about the future, what is a serious long-term risk in the U.S. China tech trade, particularly surrounding apps and surveillance, that you think is widely overlooked? So Shantha, you mentioned healthcare and games, but I was wondering if there's anything that we haven't discussed that, from your perspective, is something that our audience really should know about and should pay attention to moving forward and looking to the future. And if you want to repeat a previous answer, just something to, because you guys have been great, so.
Okay, well, let me take a quick stab at that. And it kind of relates to what I mentioned in my initial comment, which is I think now more than ever we have to be particularly attuned to the ways in which new advances in technology can be utilized, particularly by authoritarian competitors, to try to target U.S. society or U.S. national security. I can't articulate for you all the various usages, but for instance, several years ago, before when I was in my job at the International Forum for Democratic Studies, we talked to a number of forward-leaning thinkers and people who were studying kind of the future of disinformation. And I feel like just in that short span of time, since those few years, 3 or 4 years ago when we had those conversations till now, we're starting to see those things happen. And we weren't well prepared then, and we still are not well prepared. Recently, as you may have followed, the Justice Department returned indictments on several Chinese nationals who are associated with the Ministry of Public Security, I think several of which were accused of operating a troll farm, which mimicked these classic Kremlin techniques of trying to spread disinformation to divide, confuse the American public. Those are all kind of tried and tested techniques. It's interesting that now we see the PRC trying to go to that Kremlin playbook. But what's more worrying to me is the ways in which new again, artificial intelligence and other ways to generate natural-seeming content, images, imitating voices. I don't know if you're following this whole thing with, I think it's Drake in The Weeknd. I can't believe I'm trying to say this publicly without messing this up. That's just one example, right? I mean, they had this song come out that didn't come from them. Yeah. But imagine, just use your imagination to think about the ways in which these types of technologies could be used to generate very genuine-seeming disinformation, and we don't have, to use a term that uses sort of the cognitive defenses in place to guard against that. So that's just kind of putting on sort of just a lens that's just a little bit out in the future, and I think we need to get much smarter about that.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, it's quite fascinating because we have to think about, there's a little bit of a sci-fi aspect where we try to think about like what future technologies will be developed and how will we adopt them and how will we use them. But by the same token, needing to think about the ways in which that impacts democracy and our systems of governance becomes also really important. Josh or Kara, is there anything you'd like to add there?
Oh, I just one minor add-on to what Shanti said. I mean, I think, the interesting thing about Chinese disinformation efforts and the Department of Justice indictments, and just all of the reporting about this is, and I think about this a lot as a reporter, because when you think about stories you're going to cover, you think about what is the impact of what is happening. And one of the really interesting things about disinformation, Chinese disinformation, is that it's actually not very good.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's just, they don't get a lot of traction on Twitter. They don't, they haven't really had nearly the impact that Russia has had in various places, and I think part of that actually is because, or at least one theory I've come across that I think is compelling, is that Russia has, nominally has a democracy, and so Russian operators are used to dealing with sort of democratic discourse in some way, right, and having to be convincing and persuasive, and like, whereas China, like people in China are not, right? Like the people who are sort of creating propaganda campaigns that they're trying to use to disrupt, American society or for whatever political purpose they may have, they just don't have that vocabulary. And where something like ChatGPT comes in, is that it gives them a tool to be much more persuasive, right? Because now they have this ability to just put in a prompt, and whatever that prompt spits up is going to have access to all of the data that was fed into it, and all of that data comes from the U.S. And so I think Shanti's really prescient in bringing that up, and that I do think that could be that could really change the landscape for China in that sense.
Yeah, and not only that, and to be able to articulate in human-like ways using natural language processing and whatnot, to give them another arrow in their quiver. I mean, then you can narrowly target and tailor these propaganda efforts too. So you layer that onto the fact that AI helps us make determinations based off of digital behavior. You can have a digital profile. Google was doing this a long time ago. In 2016, they were categorizing users as right-leaning or left-leaning in order to enhance their ad targeting efforts. So if a nation state is sort of able to do that with these new tools, it makes them scalable, it makes them efficient, and it increases the breadth of their reach too. So I think I agree completely with this panel, and think those the information war is only going to be enhanced by these new technologies, particularly synthetic media and generative AI.
Oof. Well, all right. So a very, very optimistic, very optimistic discussion to start your Friday morning. But these are really important questions, and I think impact everyone in this room in really significant ways. So one of the things, we have a student question. So even if TikTok is banned and Lemonade and other Chinese apps are banned, can't the Chinese government just obtain U.S. data by buying it through data brokers? The officials worried about TikTok don't seem very worried about U.S. companies profiting off of our personal data. So how do we contend with that?
I think the National Data Protection Framework, and within that framework, you have to be able to, dare I say as a conservative, regulate the third-party access to this data and how data is shared, especially with those third parties. As I said before, and the kids in the room will know, Gizmodo does a lot of actually really good reporting on the fact that U.S. user data can be obtained by TikTok even if TikTok is banned. Therefore, you need to have that backstop, and that backstop is that National Data Protection Framework. Nobody more than me is very concerned about how these commercial companies use and manipulate our data. Saw these kinds of things firsthand. We're seeing the vestiges, firsthand, and we're seeing the vestiges of what it's doing to our society and the minds of our children, really, in the U.S. body politic alone. So there are a lot of legislative proposals on the horizon. Primarily, I think Senator Lee has an ad tech bill that they plan to reintroduce shortly that basically clamps down on some of the data grabbing that these companies are doing. And I think all of these things together are really good starts to enshrining American data with the protections that it deserves.
Thank you. So this is a question from Professor Lun Chopa from the Politics Department. Is there a place for reciprocity in U.S. tech policy vis-a-vis China? So is there a possibility that that the U.S. could allow companies like TikTok to operate if companies like Facebook or the Wall Street Journal? No, okay. Yeah. So John, you. All right. So this is like quite.
Well, I mean, but reciprocity is, I think, a really fascinating question, especially when it comes to free speech issues and sort of values-related industries, right? And it's particularly with news. And we've had this. There's a debate that a bunch of U.S. news organizations, including my own, had most of their American correspondents expelled from China, including me, at the beginning of the pandemic. And that was just the most sort of dramatic development in this very long-running debate about reciprocity in media, right? And whether or not China was allowing enough foreign reporters into the country, allowing enough freedom to report, given the freedom that Chinese journalists enjoy in the U.S. And it's a really difficult debate, right? Because you start talking about freedom of the press. That's a core American notion, right? And so do you restrict Chinese journalists, the ability of Chinese journalists to work here? I mean, these are not easy questions, I do think it's sort of a non-starter when you're talking about platforms, because China's just never going to ever allow any American. I mean, they tried it with LinkedIn, and even that didn't work, right? So I think that's just not going to happen. So I think reciprocity is one of those ideas that if you think about it from the U.S. standpoint, it's just kind of hard because it requires you to consider compromising on really core American ideas. If you really want to punish China, if you want to do an eye for an eye on information, China's going to win, right? Because their entire system is built on limiting information, whereas the U.S. system is built on the opposite.
So speaking of the U.S. system, another one of our great audience questions is, why has there been so little discussion about the fact? So this person brings up that there are a lot of investors in ByteDance that are U.S. investment funds, but also I want to add to this and say the economic benefits that U.S. companies are drawing from being able to access TikTok, the growing influencer industry. So why has the focus largely been on China's investment and China's involvement in propagating TikTok rather than on the investment and involvement of U.S. investment firms and U.S. Advertisers and U.S. social media influencers. So can you expand a little bit more on that and maybe discuss what those challenges are in terms of dealing with U.S. economic investment engagement in TikTok?
I think the reason why there's been so little conversation is because it impugns a lot of us. You know, it lays bare the fact that, you know, we have been, some of us have been getting rich off of what China is doing. And the way that I would sort of explain, or I have explained about the influencer issue is, you guys take one for the team. You know what I mean? There are other platforms. We like healthy competition in the tech space, and there are other platforms to use. Hopefully there will be somebody who designs a better algorithm than the For You algorithm that is more salubrious, shall we say, for the American youth. There's a lot of problems with this one now in terms of surfacing content that's, you know, eating disorder, self-harm. A lot of enterprising journalists have come to the determination that if you register on TikTok as a 13 to 14-year-old, you're going to get served content within minutes that is very detrimental to your well-being and your health in general. But putting that aside, I think influencers do at this point have a duty to sort of, you know, move and migrate to other platforms. And then I think that it's very, that gets at the, you know, the general bigger question of Chinese investment in America making GDP go up, and, you know, what do we value? Do we value that pointy line going up, or do we value the mental health of our children, or our national security, or our vulnerabilities to some of these hard cyber risks? So I think that's a trade-off that Americans have, you know, delayed making, and they need to make. And a lot of these influencers, a lot of these people who are, you know, padding their pockets, have to, frankly, take one for the team.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add to that?
Only to say that I think, you know, there is a long history of U.S. investment in the PRC surveillance state. Actually, Josh, you talk about that, and you name some of the companies, and you know, that's something I think we've always grappled with, and I think we need to be much more clear-eyed about the ways in which U.S. investment and support has actually contributed to the development of some of these really troubling trends. So I hope there's more attention to that.
Josh?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, yeah, it is true. I mean, they've been the American investors and tech companies have been involved in Chinese surveillance from the very beginning in the late 1990s, when the internet had sort of just arrived in China. So the U.S. has profited handsomely, has midwifed the whole industry basically in China, you know, and I think it's interesting because it was, you know, it's a mirror of the U.S. relationship with China in general, right? Is that for a long time, particularly before China got into the WTO, which is right around when the surveillance industry started to rise, you know, China was granted most favored nation status every year, and there was always a debate about whether China's human rights record was good enough to merit that, and so human rights was an actual you know, was a real subject in U.S. China relations. And then as soon as China joined the WTO, that kind of went away, right? I mean, people paid lip service to it, but the profits that American companies could make in China were just so enormous that no one really talked about it. And we're now in a really fascinating moment because human rights has re-entered the conversation in a real way. And I think it's, you know, I'm kind of surprised, maybe I'm cynical, but it is interesting, right? And so I think this is a moment where you now actually have human rights being raised in boardrooms in American, you know, in American corporate boardrooms as a risk, which is we've not seen for 20 years. And so what happens with that, it's hard to say, but it definitely is I think it's a really interesting moment. And if you are interested in sort of trying to shine a spotlight on American business involvement in this industry, then this is a good moment for that.
Well, Kara, did you want to add?
Well, I was just thinking, as Josh was talking, it's when you have, Tim Cook, as reported by The Information in 2016, signing a $275 billion with Apple to commit to its technical prowess, then I think we need to scrutinize joint ventures with these companies, especially when these ostensibly private companies in China have state links, or they're working in direct service of the technological development of the CCP. So it's, I think people need to know that, and not many people do.
Well, on that note, hopefully all of you have learned some new things from our panel. I'm so grateful for the excellent comments of our panelists and their sharing their wisdom with us today. Let's give them a round of applause, and thank you so much. And I want to urge all of you to stay on. We have a terrific panel coming up on China's financial investments, China's financial investments that will really build very well from where we ended up on this panel today. So thank you so much for your time and attention. And